My wife slid the divorce papers across the polished mahogany table right as our son was supposed to be blowing out his 18th birthday candles. She smiled a cold, calculating smile and whispered that her timing was absolute perfection. She thought she had me trapped in a corner perfectly positioned to steal 60% of the software empire I built from nothing. She thought I was just a fading old man with a deteriorating mind. But when the final hearing came, it was not my high-priced lawyer who destroyed her case. It was our quiet teenage son. He stood up in the middle of the courtroom, looked his mother dead in the eye, and pressed play on a digital recording device he had been hiding for 3 years. She turned pale and actually tried to sprint for the heavy oak doors, but the bailiff stopped her in her tracks. What happened next was exactly what she deserved. My name is Richard Harrison. I am 70 years old. I live in Seattle, Washington, and for the last 4 decades, I have bled sweat and endless stress to build a logistics software firm from a tiny rented desk into a corporate powerhouse worth tens of millions. I did not inherit a single dime. Everything I built with my own 2 hands, sacrificing my youth and my peace of mind so that my family would never have to know the bitter taste of poverty. My wife, Valerie, is 52 years old. She is 18 years younger than me. When we married 20 years ago, I thought I had found a sharp, intelligent partner who completely understood my drive and ambition. We had 1 son together, Tyler. Tyler is a quiet boy, heavily introverted, but an absolute genius when it comes to computers and complex technology. He rarely speaks his mind, preferring the glowing screen of his laptop to the messy, loud reality of our family dinners. Or at least that is what I always believed about him. If you are just starting to listen to this story, please hit the like button. It brings a little light to an old man's heart to know that someone out there is listening to the truth. Tell me in the comments what city you are watching from and what time it is there right now. It means the world to me to connect with you all before I explain the nightmare that unfolded in my own home. It was a Tuesday evening, pouring rain the way it always does in Seattle. The rain lashed against the tall glass windows of our formal dining room, distorting the city lights into blurry streaks of gold and red. It was a fitting backdrop for the absolute destruction of my reality. It was Tyler's 18th birthday. I had come home early from the executive office, thoroughly exhausted, but genuinely excited to celebrate my boy officially reaching adulthood. I walked through the door, expecting the rich smell of a roast in the oven. I expected a beautifully decorated cake with candles lighting up the room. Instead, the $5 million mansion was dead silent. The kitchen was entirely clean. No pots on the stove, no smell of vanilla or sugar in the air. Valerie was sitting at the far end of the dining table wearing a perfectly tailored black designer dress, slowly sipping a glass of extremely expensive red wine. Tyler was sitting directly across from her, his posture unnaturally rigid, his eyes fixed intensely on the empty ceramic plate in front of him. I walked into the room taking off my wet coat, completely confused by the freezing atmosphere. I asked where the food was. I asked where the birthday cake was. Valerie did not answer right away. She took another slow, deliberate sip of her wine, her eyes locking onto mine over the rim of the glass. Then she reached beside her chair and placed a thick, heavy manila envelope on the table. She slid it across the polished wood until it stopped right in front of where I usually sat. I looked down at the envelope, then back up at her, asking what this was all about. She looked at me, and I will never forget the chilling, completely hollow smile that spread across her face. It was not the smile of the woman I had slept next to for 20 years. It was the smile of a predator that had finally trapped its exhausted prey. Tyler is 18 today, she said, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. He is officially a legal adult. I no longer have to fight you in a messy, drawn-out court battle for custody. I no longer have to deal with child support monitors or state mandates or shared parenting schedules. My timing is absolute perfection, Richard. Go ahead. Open it. My hands felt strangely heavy as I reached for the envelope. I pulled out the crisp white legal documents. Divorce papers. But as I read through the thick stack of pages, I realized it was not just a simple request for separation. The demands printed on those pages made all the air leave my lungs. She was not asking for a clean, equitable break. She was demanding 60% of the software empire I had spent 40 years building. She was demanding exclusive ownership of the Seattle mansion, and on top of that, a permanent alimony payment of $30,000 every single month for the rest of my life. It was not a settlement. It was an execution order on my life's work. I stared at the papers, my vision blurring slightly from the shock. I asked her why she was doing this. I asked her how he could possibly think she was entitled to 60% of a technical company she had never worked a single day in. Valerie threw her head back and laughed. It was a sharp, mocking sound that echoed terribly off the high ceiling. "You are 70 years old, Richard," she said coldly. "For the last 3 years, you have been practically falling apart right in front of my eyes. You are a fading, broken old man. I have spent my prime years taking care of you, nursing your declining mind, watching you forget simple things around the house. I have earned every single penny of that company, and I am taking my share before you run it into the ground with your incompetence." I looked away from her, my heart hammering painfully against my ribs, and I looked at my son. I expected to see a terrified, heartbroken boy. I expected to see a teenager absolutely shattered by the sudden collapse of his family on his birthday. But when my eyes met Tyler's, the blood in my veins turned to ice. Tyler was not crying. He was not shaking. His knuckles were bone white as he gripped his phone resting on the mahogany table, but his face was completely unreadable. It was a mask of cold, calculating fury. He did not look at me for reassurance. He kept his eyes locked dead onto his mother. "Do you really think you have won?" Tyler whispered. His voice was incredibly steady, far too steady for a boy who had just watched his family shatter into pieces. Valerie rolled her eyes, completely dismissing him with a wave of her manicured hand. "Oh, grow up, Tyler. You will understand how the real world works when you are older." She turned her attention back to me, her eyes narrowing into dangerous, threatening slits. "I am not playing games, Richard," she warned, leaning forward over the table. "If you decide to fight this in court, if you try to drag this out and protect your precious company, I will destroy you completely. I have been meticulously documenting your erratic behavior for 3 years. I will submit your medical records to a judge and prove that you are entirely mentally unfit to handle your own finances. I will bring in private doctors who will testify about your severe memory lapses, your constant confusion, and your brain fog. I will have you legally declared incompetent and seize the conservatorship before the trial even finishes. Do not test me." I stood there, in the deafening silence of that massive empty dining room, holding the divorce papers in my trembling hands. She was right about one thing. For the last 3 years, I had been struggling immensely. I had experienced terrible cloudy brain fog. I had suffered from sudden bouts of exhaustion and severe memory slips that secretly terrified me. I thought it was just the brutal, unforgiving reality of aging. I thought it was simply my mind finally failing me after decades of endless corporate stress. But as I stood there looking at the cruel, victorious smirk on my wife's face and noticing the dark, deeply knowing glare in my 18-year-old son's eyes, a horrible, gut-wrenching realization began to claw its way into my chest. Valerie had not just been waiting for Tyler to turn 18 to avoid child support. She had been actively setting a trap. She had been building a medical case against me, carefully orchestrating every moment of my weakness. I felt a sickening dread take hold of my stomach. If she was willing to drop divorce papers on our son's birthday just to bypass custody laws, what else had she been doing behind my back? I had spent my entire life outsmarting corporate rivals, crushing hostile takeovers, and protecting my business from vicious competitors. But I had left my own front door wide open. I had let the most dangerous enemy sleep right beside me. And as I looked in at the demanding legal papers, I knew this was no longer just a divorce. This was a fight for my survival, my legacy, and my absolute sanity. The heavy silence in the dining room finally broke when I pushed my chair back, the wood scraping harshly against the imported marble floor. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I simply picked up the thick envelope of divorce papers, turned my back on the lavish birthday spread that had turned into a funeral for my marriage, and walked straight toward my home office. I knew she would follow. Valerie never could resist the chance to twist the knife and watch me bleed. Sure enough, the sharp, rhythmic click of her designer heels echoed down the hallway mere seconds later. She stepped into the office, closing the heavy mahogany doors behind her, with a soft, definitive thud. I sat behind my desk, the very desk where I had spent countless nights building the fortune she now felt entirely entitled to, and looked at her. I asked her a very simple, direct question. Why now? Why, after 20 years of marriage, after building a life together, after raising our son, was she dropping a financial execution order on my plate? I wanted to know how she could look at a man she had built a life with and try to rip away 60% of everything he had bled to create from the ground up. Valerie did not look ashamed. She did not look guilty or conflicted. Instead, she performed an absolute masterclass in emotional manipulation. She let out a long, heavy sigh, her shoulders slumping as if she were carrying the immense weight of the entire world on her back. She walked over to the leather armchair across from my desk and sank into it, pressing her perfectly manicured fingertips to her temples in a flawless display of manufactured exhaustion. She looked at me with eyes full of fake, condescending pity. She said I was living in total denial. She claimed that for the past 3 years, she had been nothing more than a glorified nursemaid, trapped in a beautiful prison. "You are 70 years old, Richard," she murmured, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy and thinly veiled disgust. "You refuse to see what is happening to your own mind. You have been suffering from severe brain fog. You forget where you put your keys. You forget important business conversations we had just hours before. You are experiencing the rapid, undeniable early stages of dementia, and it is completely destroying me." She went on detailing how she had sacrificed her best years, her youth, to care for an ailing old man whose mind was slowly evaporating into nothing. She painted herself as the tragic, devoted wife who could simply no longer bear the brutal burden of watching her husband lose his grip on reality. She said she desperately deserved to cash out. She stated with absolute conviction that she had earned every single share of my company as fair compensation for the years she had lost, taking care of a man who could barely remember his own daily schedule. It was a perfectly constructed, venomous lie designed specifically to make me feel weak, burdensome, and completely dependent on her goodwill. As she spoke, a terrifying, icy chill washed over my skin, because the most dangerous lies in the world are the ones wrapped in a thin, believable layer of truth. I sat there gripping the solid edge of my desk, running through the fragmented memories of the past 36 months. I could not deny that I had been feeling fundamentally wrong. There had been countless mornings where I woke up feeling as though my brain was submerged in thick, heavy water. I had experienced sudden, unexplained hand tremors during crucial board meetings. There were moments of profound, crushing lethargy that I had desperately tried to hide from my staff and my clients, chalking it all up to the inevitable decline of an aging body. I had blamed the grueling 60-hour work weeks. I had blamed the relentless stress of running a massive logistics software empire in a highly competitive market. But my mind snapped back to a very specific, consistent routine that had started exactly 3 years ago. Without fail, Valerie had been the one to bring me my nightly chamomile tea. She had been the one to meticulously sort my blood pressure medication into those little plastic compartments. Every single night she would stand by the bed, watching me with those calm, unblinking eyes, until I swallowed the pills and finished every last drop in the cup. She always told me it was because she loved me. She said she wanted to make sure my heart was protected and my health was maintained. Now, listening to her justify stealing my life's work because of a medical condition she was miraculously prepared to legally document, my direct, pragmatic mind began to piece together a much darker puzzle. The symptoms only started after she took over my daily medication routine. The brain fog only worsened on the nights I drank the specific tea she prepared for me. I did not let her see the gears turning in my head. I simply nodded, told her I was too exhausted to argue, and asked her to leave my office. The moment the door clicked shut, I grabbed my coat, walked out into the rain, and drove straight to a secure private hotel downtown. I needed distance and I needed legal counsel immediately. The next morning I sat in the sterile, soundproof conference room of my longtime attorney, Jonathan Pierce. Jonathan is a ruthlessly intelligent man, a legal veteran who has seen every dirty divorce trick in the corporate book. He reviewed the papers Valerie had served me, his brow furrowing deeper and deeper with every page he turned. He finally tossed the thick document onto the polished glass table and looked at me with profound, calculating suspicion. "Richard, something here does not add up at all," he said, tapping a silver pen against the listed demands. "Valerie is asking for 60% of your corporate shares, not the cash equivalent. She specifically wants the actual voting shares of your software company." Jonathan explained that spouses in her position, spouses who claim they are exhausted and just want to cleanly escape a burdensome marriage, always demand a massive lump sum cash buyout so they can take the money and run to a new life. They never want to be tied down to managing corporate equity, especially in a highly complex logistics firm they know absolutely nothing about. Yet Valerie was entirely desperate for the physical shares. She wanted voting power. She wanted a permanent seat at the executive table. Why? Why would an allegedly exhausted, traumatized wife want to deeply embed herself in the board of directors of a company she has no technical background in? Jonathan leaned forward, his voice dropping to a serious, urgent whisper. "She does not just want your money, Richard," he told me, looking me directly in the eyes. "She wants to forcibly take complete control of your entire corporate infrastructure. And to permanently finalize that exact level of hostile takeover, she desperately needs you legally declared incompetent to do it." The chilling weight of Jonathan's words settled heavily on my shoulders as I left his office and stepped back into the Seattle rain. If Valerie intended to strip me of my shares and seize total control of my firm, she needed a financial foundation inside the building. She needed someone firmly entrenched in the company's daily operations to help facilitate her hostile takeover. My mind instantly locked onto one specific person. 5 years ago, when my previous financial director retired, Valerie was adamant about who should replace him. She practically forced a resume into my hands praising a 45-year-old financial executive named Derek Lawson. She claimed he was a brilliant mind who would modernize our revenue streams. I trusted her judgment. I hired him. Now I needed to look that man squarely in the eye. I drove straight to my corporate headquarters, bypassing my usual executive suite and walking directly down the hall to the financial department. I did not knock. I simply opened the heavy glass door to Derek's office and walked in. Derek was sitting behind his wide, modern desk, typing rapidly on his dual monitors. He looked up, clearly startled by my sudden appearance. He minimized a window on his screen, a panicked motion that did not escape my notice. I sat down in the chair opposite him, maintaining a neutral expression, and placed the latest quarterly fiscal summary between us. I demanded to know why our net profits had plummeted over the past 3 years. We had secured 3 massive contracts in that time frame. Our gross revenue was at an all-time high. Yet the bottom line was bleeding out month after month. The numbers simply did not align with the reality of our sales. Derek did not flinch. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepled his fingers, and offered me a perfectly rehearsed, smooth smile. He launched into a highly complex monologue filled with dense corporate jargon. He talked in circles about unprecedented inflation rates, crippling our operational margins. He blamed sweeping structural changes in commercial tax codes that required massive capital reserves. He spoke at length about aggressive server upgrades he claimed were critical to keep our software infrastructure secure. It was a downpour of financial smokescreens carefully designed to overwhelm the listener. He spoke to me slowly, exactly the way someone might speak to a confused elderly patient. I sat there gripping the armrests of my chair, feeling anger building in my chest. I knew my own industry. I knew the operational costs of my own software. His explanations were technically plausible on the surface, but mathematically absurd when applied to our actual scale. I leaned forward, preparing to tear his fabricated financial report to shreds. But before I could utter a single word, the glass door to the office swung open. Valerie stepped into the room. She was wearing a beige trench coat, looking entirely out of place in the corporate financial wing. My heart skipped a beat. What was she doing here? I had left her at the house just hours ago. She walked straight past me, placing a gentle, protective hand on Derek's shoulder before turning to look down at me with an expression of exaggerated maternal concern. "Richard, what are you doing down here bothering Derek?" she asked, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "You know your doctor said you need to avoid high-stress situations." I stared at her, utterly bewildered by her sudden intrusion. I told her I was conducting a basic financial review of my own company. Valerie let out a sigh and looked at Derek with an apologetic smile. "Derek, please forgive him," she murmured, acting as if I were not even in the room. "His mind has been failing him so badly lately. He gets these paranoid episodes where he forgets the investments we already discussed at home. Please do not let him stress you out or disrupt your workflow. I will take him back to the house so he can rest." The sheer audacity of her performance left me temporarily speechless. She was publicly infantilizing me in front of my own executive staff. She was actively reinforcing the narrative of my cognitive decline right here in the office, building her case for the conservatorship brick by brick. But as she stood there, effectively shielding Derek from my interrogation, my eyes drifted down to Derek's left wrist, resting casually on the edge of his desk. Peeking out from beneath the crisp white cuff of his tailored shirt was a watch. It was not just any watch. It was a brand new, solid gold Rolex. I know exactly what that specific timepiece costs, because I had once considered buying it for myself as a retirement gift. It was a $40,000 watch. A heavy sensation settled deep in my gut. My intuition, the instinct that had kept me alive in the corporate world for 40 years, began screaming. A chief financial officer who claims his company is barely scraping by does not casually purchase a $40,000 watch on a Tuesday. The pieces of the puzzle were terrifying, but they were finally starting to fit together. Valerie was not just trying to steal the company through a divorce. She and Derek were actively bleeding it dry from the inside. I realized that if I stayed in that office and confronted them without undeniable proof, they would use my anger as evidence of my mental instability. They would call security. They would call an ambulance. They would win. I stood up slowly, nodding, as if I were a tired, confused old man conceding defeat. I apologized to Derek for the interruption. I told Valerie that she was right, that my head was aching, and that I needed to go lie down. I walked out of the building, got into my car, and drove away. But I did not go back to the mansion. I could not sleep under the same roof as a woman who was actively plotting my total destruction. I drove to a luxury hotel downtown, checked in under my corporate account, and bought myself a few days of isolated silence. I needed to clear my head. I needed to formulate a strategy to dismantle their operation without them ever seeing it coming. I sat in the dim light of the hotel room, staring out at the Seattle skyline, the rain tapping relentlessly against the glass. The absolute silence in the massive room was heavy, incredibly isolating, and deeply suffocating. I felt utterly alone, betrayed by the woman I had trusted with my life. Just before midnight, a quiet, hesitant knock echoed through the room. I walked over and opened the door. Tyler was standing silently in the hallway. My 18-year-old son looked absolutely exhausted. His clothes were completely damp from the cold rain, his shoulders were slumped, and the dark circles under his eyes made him look fragile. He did not say a single word to me. He slowly stepped into the quiet room, reached into his pocket, and held out his hand. Resting in his palm was a small plastic bottle of effervescent vitamins. I stared at the plastic cylinder, unable to comprehend what my son was showing me. The hotel room was completely silent. the only sound the rain against the large windows. Tyler walked into the center of the room. He looked as though he had not slept in days, carrying an exhaustion that aged his youthful face. He sat down on the edge of the mattress and gently placed the plastic bottle on the wooden nightstand. He kept his dark eyes fixed on the patterned carpet beneath his wet sneakers. I asked him what he was doing here so late, and what a bottle of vitamins had to do with the catastrophe we had witnessed at the dining room table earlier. Tyler took a slow, trembling breath, rubbed the back of his neck, and finally looked up at me. His gaze was incredibly mature, carrying a heavy burden. "Dad," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "For the last 3 years, I have been watching her. I have been watching everything she does. And for the last 3 years, I have been secretly swapping the pills Mom gives you every night with these effervescent vitamins." The words hung in this cold air, thick and incomprehensible. I shook my head, stepping closer to him, trying to process the magnitude of what he was saying. I asked him what he meant. Valerie had been giving me my prescribed blood pressure medication, the small white tablets the doctor had mandated for my cardiovascular health. Tyler let out a bitter, hollow laugh. "They were not for your blood pressure," Dad Tyler said, his voice hardening with suppressed rage. "Not even close. When I was 15, I noticed she was keeping a locked lockbox in the back of her closet. One afternoon when she was out meeting with Derek, I managed to pick the lock. I found hundreds of small white tablets sorted into unlabeled prescription bottles. I took a few of them and spent days researching the chemical composition online." Tyler paused, resting his elbows on his knees. "They were high doses of lorazepam," he explained, his eyes locking onto mine. "It is a heavy, highly potent clinical sedative. When given to an elderly patient in prolonged, unmonitored doses, it does not just put them to sleep. It actively induces severe cognitive impairment. It mimics the exact symptoms of early-onset dementia. It causes deep memory loss, severe lethargy, chronic hand tremors, and aggressive brain fog. She was not treating your heart, Dad. She was methodically and intentionally destroying your brain." I stood frozen in the middle of the room. The horror of his words crashed into me like a physical blow. I looked at the small plastic bottle, and then back at my son as a wave of realizations began to flood my mind. Suddenly, the last 36 months of my life made sense. I thought back to every single time I had traveled out of state for conferences or client meetings. Whenever I was away from the Seattle mansion, whenever I was out of Valerie's reach and staying in hotels, my mind would clear. The fog would slowly lift. My hands would stop shaking during presentations. I had always attributed those brief windows of clarity to a change in scenery or a break from house stress. I never once suspected that I was simply experiencing chemical withdrawal from a heavy clinical sedative. The sheer scale of the betrayal was almost impossible to process. My own wife, the woman who smiled at me every morning across the breakfast table, the woman who handed me a warm cup of tea every night, had been deliberately poisoning me. She had been purposefully keeping me in a drug-induced chemical haze to slowly construct a fraudulent medical history. She wanted me confused. She wanted me weak. She needed me to look exactly like a failing, helpless old man so that no judge would ever question her petition for total financial and medical control over my life. An overwhelming wave of gratitude and guilt washed over me. I looked at Tyler, my quiet, introverted son, the boy I thought was isolating himself in his bedroom playing video games and avoiding our family dynamics. He had not been ignoring me. He had been quietly saving my life. Every single day for 3 years, a teenage boy had to sneak into his mother's bathroom, remove the toxic sedatives she had laid out, and replace them with vitamins. He had carried the agonizing weight of his mother's monstrous secret, protecting my mind and my safety without ever breathing a word of it, waiting for the exact right moment to expose her entirely. That is why I felt so incredibly sharp and lucid right now. That is why I had the mental clarity to challenge Derek today. Tyler had kept my mind intact. A sudden violent surge of adrenaline rushed through my veins. The initial shock rapidly morphed into blinding, consuming rage. I turned my back on Tyler and aggressively marched toward the closet. I grabbed my heavy wool coat from the hanger, my hands shaking with an intense burning fury. I reached for my car keys on the desk, my mind racing with a million ways to destroy her. I turned and told Tyler we were leaving this room immediately. I was going to storm straight back into that $5 million mansion, drag Valerie out of her pristine bedroom, and call the police. I was going to have her arrested for attempted murder and the malicious administration of unauthorized narcotics. I was going to watch the authorities haul her out into the pouring rain. I grabbed the brass handle of the door, fully prepared to unleash hell. But before I could turn the handle, Tyler was there. He moved so much faster than I ever anticipated, stepping directly between me and the heavy wooden door, blocking my exit. He reached out and grabbed my forearm. His grip was surprisingly strong, anchoring me in place. "Not yet, Dad," Tyler said firmly, his dark eyes burning with a calm, terrifying intensity that mirrored my own. "You cannot go to the police right now. Attempted poisoning is terrible, but without the physical drugs in her possession, she will just claim I am a troubled teenager, making up lies to protect you in the divorce. She will effortlessly spin this to make you look incredibly paranoid, utterly delusional, and deeply unstable to the authorities. That is exactly what she wants you to do." I stared right at him, my chest heaving with contained anger, demanding to know exactly why we should wait a single second longer to expose a woman trying to poison me. Tyler slowly let go of my arm, took a very deep, steadying breath, and looked at me with a grim expression. "Because that is not even the worst part of her plan, Dad," he whispered. "The pills were just her sick, twisted way of keeping you compliant. You need to see what she and Derek have actually been doing behind closed doors with your company. Please just sit down. You need to see the server." Tyler moved past me and placed his heavy black laptop squarely on the small, circular table near the window. He opened the screen and instantly lines of dense, scrolling code reflected in his dark eyes. I sat down on the edge of the bed, watching my son work with a level of speed and technical fluency that I had entirely underestimated. He was a prodigy. I knew he was gifted with computers, but I always assumed his skills were limited to gaming or harmless programming projects. I had no idea he was operating at a level that bordered on professional espionage. Tyler did not look up from the screen as his fingers danced across the keyboard. He told me that his investigation began 3 years ago, right around the time he turned 15. He had borrowed his mother's unlocked phone to look up a recipe for a school project while she was in the shower. A notification popped up on her screen. It was an explicit, highly disturbing text message from Derek Lawson, the chief financial officer I had recently hired, based entirely on her glowing recommendation. Tyler said that instead of running to me in tears, he panicked and made a very calculated decision. He quietly forwarded the message to a secure server he built himself. Over the next few weeks, he used his advanced understanding of network security to completely clone her cloud storage drive. He gained real-time access to every single text, email, and digital footprint she generated. But Tyler knew digital records could be easily deleted or legally dismissed as fabricated. He needed raw, undeniable audio. He confessed that he had spent his saved allowance ordering military-grade microphones online. When Valerie took me to those endless, exhausting doctor appointments to document my supposed cognitive decline, Tyler was home unscrewing the wooden baseboards in my study, the dining room, and our master bedroom, planting the tiny listening devices deep within the walls. He had basically turned our massive Seattle mansion into a fully functional surveillance grid. He pressed a button on his keyboard, pulling up a deeply nested folder containing hundreds of categorized audio files. He hovered his cursor over a file dated just 2 weeks ago. He warned me to brace myself, then pressed play. The crisp, clear sound of my own living room filled the sterile hotel space. I could hear the familiar clinking of crystal wine glasses, followed by the deep, resonant voice of Derek Lawson. Derek was laughing, a rich, arrogant sound that made my stomach churn violently. He was telling Valerie how incredibly simple it had been to confuse me during the last quarterly financial review. Then I heard my wife's voice. Valerie sounded relaxed, utterly devoid of the stress she constantly faked when I was around. She laughed right along with him, calling me a pathetic, trusting old fool. She boasted about how easily I swallowed the fabricated medical diagnosis of early-onset dementia. She bragged to Derek that the heavy sedatives were working flawlessly, turning my normally sharp, aggressive business mind into a compliant, forgetful pile of mush. She said she could barely keep a straight face in the doctor's office when the neurologist suggested I hand over financial power of attorney to reduce my daily stress. Derek told her she deserved an Academy Award for her performance as the grieving, exhausted caregiver. They clinked their glasses together in a sickening toast to my rapid drug-induced deterioration. I sat on the hotel bed, my hands gripping the thick fabric of the mattress so tightly my knuckles ached. Hearing her voice, hearing the pure, unadulterated malice and mockery in the very room where we had supposedly built a life together, was infinitely worse than reading any divorce demand. It was a visceral, deeply humiliating violation. My vision actually swam with an intense, blinding rage. Every instinct in my 70-year-old body screamed at me to march over to Derek's upscale condominium and tear him apart with my bare hands. I wanted to destroy them both, physically, to shatter the arrogant confidence they held while mocking my artificially failing mind. But as the audio file came to an end and the silence rushed back into the hotel room, the cold, calculating logic that had made me a multimillionaire began to overtake my burning fury. I forced myself to take a slow, measured breath. I looked at the glowing screen of Tyler's laptop, analyzing the situation with the ruthless pragmatism I normally reserved for hostile corporate takeovers. I knew the law. I knew that despite the absolute moral victory these recordings represented, they were completely illegal. Tyler was a minor when he installed those wiretaps. Washington is a two-party consent state. If we brought these audio files to a judge or the police, a clever defense attorney would have them thrown out instantly as inadmissible evidence obtained through an illegal invasion of privacy. Worse, they could potentially press criminal charges against my son for unauthorized surveillance and hacking. I could not risk Tyler's future to satisfy my immediate need for vengeance. The wiretaps were the map, but they could not be the weapon. If I wanted to completely annihilate Valerie and Derek, I needed something undeniable. I needed a paper trail of hard, admissible financial evidence that no lawyer in the country could ever suppress. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my coat. I officially transitioned from a betrayed, heartbroken husband into a silent, methodical hunter. I told Tyler that his work was brilliant, but we had to be incredibly careful. I placed my hands on his tired shoulders and instructed him to go back to the massive mansion and continue playing the exact role he had perfected over the past 3 years. He needed to be the quiet, thoroughly depressed, utterly invisible teenager who spent all his waking hours mindlessly playing video games. He absolutely could not let his manipulative mother see even a tiny fraction of the dangerous truth hiding in his eyes. He nodded solemnly, understanding the immense life-altering gravity of our current situation. After he quietly slipped out of the room to catch a late rideshare. Back home, I locked the heavy hotel door and walked straight over to the polished wooden desk. I pulled a prepaid, totally untraceable mobile phone from my leather briefcase, a specific device I strictly kept for managing highly sensitive international corporate negotiations. I dialed a highly secure number I had not actively used in over a decade. It belonged to an elite, utterly ruthless forensic accounting firm based out of Chicago. An aggressive team composed entirely of former federal agents who specialized exclusively in dismantling highly complex corporate embezzlement structures in absolute secrecy. The burner phone rang exactly twice before a gruff, intensely familiar voice answered on the other end of the encrypted line. I did not bother with polite pleasantries. I immediately gave him my full name, provided my distinct authorization code, and told him I desperately needed a completely untraceable deep-dive financial audit launched directly into my own chief financial officer, starting exactly tonight. The silent corporate hunt had officially begun. The auditors I hired from Chicago worked with the precision of surgeons. They did not touch the physical servers at my office, fearing that Derek might have set up automated alerts to detect unauthorized access. Instead, they mirrored my company data remotely, in the dead of night, creating a digital twin of our entire financial infrastructure. I sat in my hotel suite for 3 straight days, watching the live updates on a secure encrypted laptop. Every hour felt like a decade as the ghost team peeled back the layers of deception that Derek and Valerie had spent years constructing. By the second night, the first major crack appeared in their armor. The auditors bypassed the vague tax documentation and tracked the outgoing wires to a cluster of 3 limited liability companies registered in Delaware. These were classic shell companies, entities with no physical offices, no employees, and no actual products. They existed for one purpose: only to serve as a high-speed funnel for siphoned corporate cash. My firm had been paying out nearly $4 million in invoices over the last 18 months, all under the guise of third-party information technology consulting fees. I knew my IT infrastructure intimately, and I knew for a fact that we had not hired external consultants for anything remotely approaching that volume of work. Derek had simply been writing checks to companies that he and Valerie personally controlled, effectively paying themselves a fortune from my own bank account while pretending it was a legitimate business expense. The deeper the team dug, the more malicious the motive became. They managed to crack into a protected, encrypted file that Derek had hidden within the deeper subdirectories of the project management server. It was a business plan for a rival software startup, fully mapped out with our own proprietary code, our unique algorithm designs, and our entire confidential client database. Derek was not just stealing cash to fund a lavish lifestyle. He was systematically dismantling my legacy to build his own future. The pieces suddenly snapped together with terrifying clarity. Valerie did not just want 60% of my company in the divorce to secure her own financial future. She wanted that majority stake so she could force a shareholder vote to liquidate the firm. Once the company was gutted, she and Derek would inherit the wreckage, absorb my entire market share, and launch their own competing business without the burden of having to actually invent anything. They were planning to burn my 40 years of hard work to the ground and dance on the ashes with the very resources I provided. I felt a cold, hard numbness spread through my limbs as I stared at the screen. The betrayal was not just a passing affair or a petty argument. It was a calculated, long-term professional execution. My wife and my CFO had viewed me as a dying animal waiting for me to slowly succumb to the induced dementia so they could finish their harvest. I began to understand why Valerie was so desperate to win the conservatorship. With legal control over my medical decisions and finances, she could have silenced me in a private facility while they quietly stripped the company bare. She would have controlled the narrative, controlled the wealth, and controlled my life until the moment my heart finally stopped. Just as the lead auditor from Chicago called to confirm that they had secured all the necessary banking records and digital footprints, my phone vibrated violently on the desk. It was Jonathan, my attorney. His voice was tight, rushed, and stripped of his usual calm composure. "Richard, we have a major problem," he stated immediately. "I just received an urgent notice from the county court. Valerie is not just moving forward with the divorce filing. She has escalated the situation significantly. She has just submitted an emergency petition for a court-ordered conservatorship. She is effectively trying to take over your legal personhood right now, effectively claiming you are incapable of managing even the most basic elements of your daily existence. She wants the judge to sign the order on an emergency basis before the divorce trial even begins." I looked at the clock, the red digits glowing in the dark hotel room. It was nearly 3 in the morning. The city outside was quiet, but my mind was a raging storm of strategy and cold determination. I told Jonathan that I would be at his office by 8 o'clock sharp. We were no longer playing defense. We were going to provide the court with something they absolutely did not expect. I had the financial audit. I had the records of the shell companies. And now I was going to use Valerie's own emergency petition as the catalyst for her total ruin. I was ready to walk into that courtroom and ensure that when the dust finally settled, she would be the one losing everything. The hunt was over. The trap was sprung. I arrived at the office of Jonathan precisely at 8 in the morning, my mind perfectly clear and my resolve hardened into steel. The Seattle rain had mercifully stopped, but the atmosphere inside the polished mahogany conference room was incredibly heavy and suffocating. Jonathan sat rigidly at the long glass table, entirely surrounded by thick stacks of legal filings bearing the official county court seal. He did not offer his usual warm, reassuring greeting. Instead, he simply looked at me with a grim, deeply troubled expression and pushed a thick manila folder across the table, quietly instructing me to read the emergency petition. Scanning the dense legal terminology, I saw Valerie painting a horrifying fabricated picture of a man teetering on the absolute brink of total mental collapse. Her sworn affidavit falsely claimed I was rapidly deteriorating, experiencing severe cognitive breakdowns, and wandering aimlessly around our property at all hours of the night. She stated with conviction that I was highly aggressive, very paranoid, and presented an immediate critical danger to myself and the financial assets of my company. However, the most damning piece of paper in the entire file was a certified medical report from a private neurologist named Dr. Eris Thorne. Jonathan pointed his silver pen at the signature. His legal team had thoroughly investigated Thorne late last night. Thorne operated a highly discreet private concierge clinic, catering exclusively to ultra-wealthy clients who desperately needed unethical medical favors. According to the rapid financial investigation, Derek Lawson had authorized a direct corporate wire transfer of $50,000 to that private clinic just 3 days ago under the fraudulent guise of an executive wellness consultation. Thorne was completely corrupted, explicitly paid off by my chief financial officer to legally declare that I was suffering from rapidly advancing Alzheimer's disease. The sheer calculated malice of their strategy sent a cold shiver down my spine. Jonathan carefully spelled out the exact implications of the trap they had set. If the judge granted this emergency conservatorship, my life as an independent human being would end. Valerie would instantly gain absolute legal control over my entire existence. She would have sole authority to manage my finances, liquidate my portfolios, and dictate the operational control of my software company. The conservatorship would grant her absolute power over my medical decisions. She could legally sedate me, force me into a psychiatric facility, and keep me heavily medicated until I truly lost my mind. I would become a prisoner in my own home, completely stripped of all basic human rights. My immediate instinct was to fight back with overwhelming force. I wanted to drop the forensic audit on the table, showing the judge the Delaware shell companies and the $4 million stolen through fake consulting fees. I wanted to drag Tyler into the courtroom to testify about the high doses of lorazepam she had been feeding me. I told Jonathan to file an immediate countersuit, blast their conspiracy open, and send the authorities straight to their doors. Jonathan slowly shook his head, analyzing the legal battlefield with cold precision. He told me we absolutely could not reveal our hand yet. If we brought forward the financial audit now, Valerie and Derek would scramble to destroy the offshore accounts, shred the physical evidence, and potentially flee the jurisdiction before criminal charges could be finalized. Furthermore, the wiretaps were legally inadmissible, and bringing up the poisoning without the physical pills would make me look exactly like the deeply paranoid, delusional old man Valerie claimed I was. The judge would view my aggressive accusations as textbook symptoms of dementia-induced paranoia. Instead, Jonathan proposed a counter-move that required a terrifying amount of discipline. I had to step directly into her trap and let Valerie believe she was winning. The only way to legally dismantle her petition without tipping them off to our financial investigation was to beat the medical claim on absolute merit. Jonathan had already filed a motion demanding an independent neurological evaluation by a court-appointed medical board entirely unaffiliated with Dr. Thorne. I had to undergo a rigorous, exhaustive cognitive assessment conducted by 3 state-certified specialists. Until that independent evaluation was officially submitted to the court, I had to maintain the absolute illusion that I was weak, vulnerable, and completely stressed. I could not act like a sharp, vengeful chief executive. I had to go back to the mansion walk with a slow, hesitant gait and allow Valerie to act out her role as the exhausted caregiver. I had to endure her condescending smiles, her fake sympathy, and her manipulative whispers without breaking character. I had to play the victim, knowing that one slip in my performance could cause them to panic and liquidate the stolen funds before we could successfully freeze their assets. It was the hardest assignment of my entire life. I spent the next 3 days living in a waking nightmare. I returned to the sprawling estate, moving through the grand hallways like a ghost. Whenever Valerie was in the room, I deliberately misplaced my reading glasses. I asked her the same question twice. I let my hands tremble slightly when I held my morning coffee cup. Every time I looked into her calm, calculating eyes, my blood boiled, but I forced my face to remain slack and confused. Tyler played his part flawlessly, staying silent and withdrawn, passing me in the corridors without a second glance. The psychological toll of pretending to lose my mind in front of the woman actively trying to destroy it was pure agony. On Thursday evening, the tension in the house reached an unbearable peak. The court hearing for the emergency conservatorship was scheduled for Friday morning. I was sitting in my study staring blankly at a book to keep up the facade when Tyler silently slipped into the room. He closed the heavy mahogany door with a soft click and walked swiftly over to my leather chair. His face was pale, and his breathing was shallow and rapid. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, his fingers moving frantically across the illuminated screen. He held the phone out to me. His digital surveillance had just captured a new encrypted text message sent from the device belonging to Valerie directly to the private number of Derek. I looked at the glowing screen, reading the stark, cold words my wife had just typed. The old man is taking the bait completely. He is practically a walking corpse today. Once the judge grants the conservatorship on Friday morning, we pull the plug on his company accounts. Transfer everything to the Delaware accounts before noon. A freezing chill radiated through my chest. The deadline was set. Friday morning. In less than 14 hours, I would stand before a superior court judge. I would have to present the results of my independent medical board evaluation, reveal the highly secretive audit, and detonate the life I had built over the last 20 years. The trap was fully armed, the countdown had reached its final hours, and there was absolutely no turning back now. This was the ultimate final battle for my entire legacy and my absolute survival. The morning of the medical evaluation arrived with a suffocating heaviness. I walked into the sterile, brightly lit offices of the state-appointed medical board, deeply aware that my entire future hinged on the next few hours. 3 independent neurologists entirely unaffiliated with Dr. Thorne or his corrupted private clinic put me through an agonizingly rigorous series of cognitive, psychological, and neurological assessments. They tested my memory, recall, my spatial awareness, my executive function, and my verbal fluency. I did not hold back. I answered every question with the sharp, aggressive precision that had built my software empire. I detailed complex logistical algorithms, quoted the exact profit margins of my firm from the last fiscal quarter down to the final decimal point, and navigated their incredibly deceptive psychological traps with absolutely flawless clarity. When the grueling, exhaustive examination finally concluded, the lead neurologist looked at me with a profound sense of utter bewilderment. He stated unequivocally that my brain was not just perfectly healthy, but functioning at an elite, highly optimal level for a man of absolutely any age. There was absolutely zero trace of dementia, Alzheimer's disease, or any cognitive decline whatsoever. I had passed with flying colors. The medical foundation of Valerie's entire conservatorship petition was instantly obliterated. However, Jonathan is a master tactician who understands the immense power of a strategic ambush. He immediately filed an emergency ex parte motion with the presiding judge, citing extreme privacy concerns regarding my corporate standing, to have the official medical results strictly sealed until the actual hearing began. The judge agreed. The clean bill of health was locked away in a confidential file, effectively blinding my wife to the reality of the situation. Valerie and Derek were allowed to continue operating under the incredibly dangerous false assumption that their hired doctor's fraudulent report was the only medical evidence the court possessed. We were deliberately leading them into a dark, inescapable corner. With the medical trap firmly set, I returned to the hotel room late Thursday afternoon to finalize our preparations. Tyler was sitting at the small table by the window, bathed in the pale light of his laptop screen. He was methodically transferring data files, his young face drawn tight, with a level of exhaustion no 18-year-old should ever have to carry. I walked over and gently pulled the chair out opposite him, sitting down to look at my son. Really look at him. For the first time in 3 years, the haze was gone, the immediate panic of the financial audit was handled, and I could finally see the immense heartbreaking toll this invisible war had taken on him. While his peers were going to high school parties, attending football games, and experiencing the carefree joy of their teenage years, Tyler had been living in a state of constant, terrifying vigilance. He had been quietly swapping out toxic sedatives every single night to save my brain from permanent chemical damage. He had spent his evenings compiling massive, heavily encrypted spreadsheets of offshore financial fraud, actively analyzing dense corporate tax codes, and listening to countless audio recordings of his own mother plotting the violent destruction of our family. He had effectively lost his mother the exact moment he discovered her horrific betrayal, and he had completely sacrificed his youth to protect a father who was too heavily drugged to even notice he was actively drowning. A profound, absolutely crushing wave of guilt washed over me. I reached out and placed my hand firmly over his, stopping his tired fingers from typing another line of code. I told him how incredibly deeply sorry I was that he had to bear this horrific burden entirely alone. I told him that his brilliant, silent bravery had saved my life and my legacy. I looked into his dark, tired eyes and promised him, with every ounce of conviction in my soul, that his watch was officially over. I swore to him that today we were going to end this nightmare completely, and that I would never, ever let anyone hurt him again. Tyler swallowed hard, blinking back a sudden rush of tears, and simply nodded. A sharp knock on the door broke the emotional weight of the room. Jonathan stepped inside, carrying a thick, reinforced leather briefcase. It was time to assemble the nuclear payload. We cleared the small circular table and laid out the absolute destruction of Valerie and Derek. Jonathan pulled out the pristine, sealed medical evaluation from the state board, proving my flawless cognitive health and instantly exposing Dr. Thorne as a paid fraudulent actor. Next, he produced the massive comprehensive financial audit from the Ghost team in Chicago. The pages detailed the exact flow of $4 million, meticulously tracing the stolen corporate funds from my software company directly into the 3 Delaware shell companies controlled by Derek and Valerie. The audit also included the cracked, encrypted business plan, proving their intent to steal my proprietary algorithms and client databases to launch a rival startup. Finally, Tyler handed Jonathan a small, sleek, black USB drive. It contained a carefully curated selection of the most damning audio files, specifically formatted and legally primed to be used not as primary evidence, but as an undeniable tool for impeachment if Valerie attempted to lie under oath about her knowledge of my true medical condition or her relationship with Derek. We had the motive, we had the method, and we had the undeniable physical proof of their massive corporate embezzlement and medical tampering. Every single document was double-checked, indexed, and loaded back into Jonathan's heavy briefcase. We were no longer fighting a divorce. We were executing a highly coordinated, perfectly legal demolition. The following morning, the Seattle sky was an appropriate slate gray as we arrived at the massive concrete steps of the Superior Courthouse. I walked through the heavy glass doors with Jonathan by my side and Tyler trailing just a few steps behind. As we entered the wide, echoing corridor leading to the family court division, I saw them. Valerie was standing near the heavy oak doors of the courtroom. She was dressed in a highly conservative, elegant navy blue dress, her makeup perfectly subdued to project the exact image of a tragic, utterly exhausted, and deeply heartbroken wife forced into a terrible position. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, performing her role flawlessly for the bailiffs and clerks passing by. Derek was seated casually on a long wooden bench in the public gallery area just outside the doors. He was wearing a sharp, expensive gray suit, and as his eyes met mine, a slow, arrogant smirk spread across his face. They looked at my slightly hunched posture, my extremely quiet demeanor, and the dark, grim expression fixed firmly on Jonathan's face, and they clearly believed the entire illusion we had carefully crafted. They thought I was a broken, hopelessly confused old man walking willingly to my own financial execution. They truly believed they had already won the entire war. They had absolutely no idea whatsoever that they were standing directly on a buried landmine, and that I was completely prepared to pull the final trigger today. The doors of courtroom 4 swung open, and we filed inside. The atmosphere was stifling, thick with the quiet tension that precedes a legal slaughter. I sat at the respondent's table, maintaining the posture of a defeated, frail old man. I slumped my shoulders, keeping my gaze fixed on the table, avoiding eye contact. Jonathan sat to my left, arranging his legal pads with a practiced, terrifying calm. Tyler took a seat in the front row of the gallery, blending into the background, a silent observer holding the keys to our ultimate victory in his pocket. The bailiff's voice boomed through the room, demanding all rise as the Honorable Judge Margaret Caldwell took her place at the bench. She was a stern woman with vast judicial experience. She adjusted her glasses, looked at the thick file containing the emergency petition, and called the session to order. Valerie's attorney, a sleek corporate litigator, immediately called his client to the stand. Valerie walked slowly toward the witness box, her movement calculated to project profound sorrow and immense fatigue. She took the oath, sat down, and began the greatest performance of her entire manipulative life. Under the gentle guiding questions of her lawyer, Valerie started to weep. They were not dramatic sobs, but quiet tears she wiped away with a steady hand. She spoke to the judge in a trembling voice, detailing what she categorized as my mental decline. She spun an elaborate, agonizing tale of a brilliant husband whose mind was rapidly evaporating into a fog of paranoia and confusion. She described fictional nights where I wandered the estate, unable to recognize my surroundings, screaming at invisible enemies. She painted a horrifying picture of an erratic man who was a critical danger to himself and the massive corporate empire he built. She begged the judge, her voice cracking with manufactured emotion, to grant the emergency conservatorship immediately. She claimed she could not bear to watch my life's work be systematically destroyed by my failing mind. She argued that transferring 60% of the corporate equity into her exclusive control was not an act of greed, but an act of desperate preservation. She needed the voting power to protect my employees, secure our son's future, and entirely shield my legacy from my own erratic, dementia-fueled decisions. It was a flawless narrative. If I had not known the poisonous truth, I might have believed the tragedy she was selling. I risked a brief glance toward the gallery. Derek was sitting there, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, watching Valerie with absolute admiration. He vibrated with arrogant satisfaction. Once Valerie concluded her tearful testimony, stepping down from the box with the sympathetic gaze of the entire courtroom following her, her attorney called their star witness. Dr. Eris Thorne walked through the swinging doors with the absolute confidence of a man entirely accustomed to being believed without question. He took the stand, presenting his medical credentials to the court. He spoke with a smooth, authoritative cadence, stripping the emotion from the room and replacing it with cold certainty. Under oath, under the direct penalty of perjury, the corrupt neurologist testified that he had examined me on multiple occasions over the past 6 months. He looked at Judge Caldwell and stated that I was suffering from the aggressive late stages of Alzheimer's disease. He used dense medical terminology to describe my supposed cognitive deficits, referencing severe memory lapses, lack of executive function, and a complete inability to comprehend complex financial realities. He testified that the progression of the disease was unusually rapid and entirely irreversible. He concluded that without immediate forceful intervention, through a full legal conservatorship, I would inevitably cause catastrophic financial harm to my entire estate and company. He told the judge that placing me under Valerie's complete control was the only medically ethical and legally responsible course of action available. It was a masterclass in medical perjury funded directly by the corporate accounts they were attempting to steal. When Dr. Thorne finished his damning testimony, a heavy, oppressive silence fell over the courtroom. The air felt uncomfortably thick, suffocating, completely devoid of hope. Judge Caldwell slowly turned her gaze toward my table. Her eyes, previously stern, were now filled with profound, quiet pity. She looked at me not as a respected corporate chief executive, but as a tragic, fading ghost of a man who could no longer defend himself against the ravages of time and disease. It was the exact look Valerie had engineered this situation to produce. The judge cleared her throat and looked directly at my attorney. She asked Jonathan if he wished to cross-examine the witness. This was the moment a defense attorney would tear into the doctor's credentials, demand secondary opinions, or object to the findings. Instead, Jonathan did nothing. He sat completely still, his hands resting flat on his pristine briefcase. He slowly stood up, buttoned his suit jacket with an agonizingly calm, deliberate motion, and looked directly at the judge. He stated in a clear, steady voice that he had no questions for this witness. He told the judge that the defense waived the right to cross-examine Dr. Thorne. A ripple of genuine shock ran through the courtroom. Valerie's attorney blinked, unprepared for a total surrender. Dr. Thorne looked slightly insulted, awkwardly excusing himself from the witness stand. I watched Valerie from the corner of my eye, her brow furrowed in deep confusion. She exchanged a rapid, highly anxious glance with Derek in the gallery. This was not part of the script they had anticipated. They expected a desperate, screaming fight from us. They expected me to lose my temper, to prove my paranoia, to fight back with the chaotic energy of a confused, terrified old man. The deafening silence from our side of the room unnerved them. However, as the initial shock faded, the confusion on Valerie's face melted into a triumphant, satisfied smile. She believed we had surrendered. She thought we had looked at her overwhelming medical evidence and given up the fight. Judge Caldwell let out a soft, resigned sigh. She adjusted her reading glasses and reached for her pen, preparing to sign the emergency conservatorship order that would end my life as a free, independent man. She looked down at Jonathan, asking if the defense had any concluding remarks or final submissions before she delivered her ruling on the immediate transfer of equity and medical control. Jonathan did not hesitate for a single second. He did not ask the judge for a temporary recess. He did not beg or ask for any kind of mercy. He stepped out from behind the heavy oak defense table, walking directly into the very center of the quiet room. The atmosphere shifted, the air crackling with electric tension. He looked squarely at the judge, his voice echoing off the high walls. "Your Honor," he declared, his tone instantly stripping away all pretense of defeat. "We completely and unequivocally reject the fraudulent emergency petition for conservatorship. We utterly reject the entirety of the proposed divorce settlement demands. And we hereby call our first and absolute only witness to the stand. My son, Tyler Harrison." The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom seemed to absorb the collective gasp that rippled through the gallery as my son stood up. Tyler did not look like the invisible, depressed teenager Valerie had grown so accustomed to ignoring. He looked tall, composed, and possessed a quiet strength that mirrored the best parts of my own youth. He walked down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing with a steady rhythm against the polished marble floor. Valerie immediately shifted in her seat. The mask of the weeping, exhausted caregiver slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing a sharp, calculating panic underneath. Her attorney, sensing the sudden shift in the narrative, leaped to his feet. He frantically objected to Jonathan calling Tyler to the stand. He argued loudly that a teenager had absolutely no place in a complex financial conservatorship hearing, claiming it was highly inappropriate and emotionally damaging to drag a child into a bitter marital dispute. Judge Caldwell peered over her glasses, her expression hardening into absolute authority. She struck her gavel once, a sharp crack that silenced the desperate lawyer, and firmly overruled the objection. She stated that Tyler was legally an adult and perfectly capable of providing sworn testimony if the defense deemed it relevant. As Tyler stepped into the witness box and raised his right hand to take the solemn oath, Valerie caught his eye. She leaned forward slightly, pasting on a sickeningly sweet maternal smile. She silently mouthed the words, "It is okay," clearly believing that her son was simply too intimidated, too fragile, and too thoroughly broken by her years of psychological dominance to ever speak against her in a court of law. She thought he would crumble under the pressure. She could not have been more wrong. Before Jonathan asked Tyler a single question, he turned his attention back to Judge Caldwell. He reached into his heavy leather briefcase and retrieved a thick manila envelope sealed with red wax and stamped with the official insignia of the State Medical Board. Jonathan walked confidently to the bench and handed the packet directly to the judge. He announced for the official court record that he was submitting a comprehensive independent neurological evaluation. He specifically noted that this examination was conducted just 48 hours prior by a panel of 3 highly respected state-certified neurologists. Judge Caldwell broke the wax seal, her brow furrowing, as she pulled out the pristine documents. The courtroom descended into a breathless, suffocating silence as she read the findings. I watched her eyes track back and forth across the page. I watched the profound pity she previously held for me completely vanish, replaced instantly by a cold, radiating judicial fury. The State Board had unequivocally concluded that my brain function was exceptionally healthy, optimal, and entirely devoid of any cognitive decline, dementia, or Alzheimer's disease. Jonathan turned slowly and looked directly at Dr. Thorne, who was still hovering awkwardly near the plaintiff's table. Jonathan casually asked the judge if she would like to reconcile the State Board's flawless medical report with the terrifyingly grim prognosis Dr. Thorne had just delivered under the penalty of perjury. Dr. Thorne physically recoiled. The arrogant, smooth composure he had displayed moments ago completely shattered. Profuse beads of sweat broke out across his forehead. He practically scrambled toward the heavy oak doors, his legal liability crashing down upon him with the force of a freight train. Valerie stared at the fleeing doctor in absolute horror, her primary medical foundation entirely obliterated in a matter of seconds. With the medical narrative completely destroyed, Jonathan turned his calculating gaze to the witness box. He asked Tyler to explain exactly why Dr. Thorne might have been given a financial incentive to lie. Tyler gripped the edges of the wooden stand, his knuckles turning white, and took a deep breath. He spoke in a voice so clear, it pierced the heavy silence of the courtroom like a blade. He testified under oath that for the past 3 years, he had been systematically investigating his own mother. He detailed the afternoon he was 15 years old the moment he picked the lock on the metal box hidden in the back of her closet. He described finding hundreds of small, unlabeled white tablets. He explained to the silent room how he meticulously researched the chemical composition of those pills, discovering that they were high doses of lorazepam. Jonathan prompted him to explain the medical function of that specific drug. Tyler looked directly at Judge Caldwell and stated it was a heavy clinical sedative designed to induce profound memory loss, chronic lethargy, severe brain fog, and intense neurological confusion. It was an artificial poison meant to mimic the exact symptoms of rapidly advancing dementia. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Valerie's lawyer sank into his leather chair, the color draining from his face as he realized the magnitude of the criminal conspiracy he had unwittingly walked into. Jonathan asked the most crucial question of the entire morning. He asked Tyler what he did with that horrifying information. Tyler looked across the room, his dark eyes locking onto mine with an unspoken bond of love and absolute loyalty. He told the judge that he knew if he went to the police without solid proof, his mother would easily spin lies to dismiss him as a troubled teenager. So he made a silent, terrifying choice. Every single night, for 36 consecutive months, he crept into the master bathroom, carefully removed the toxic sedatives his mother had laid out for my nightly routine, and meticulously replaced them with cheap, effervescent vitamins of the exact same size and shape. He testified that he spent his entire high school existence guarding my mind, essentially keeping me alive and completely lucid, while Valerie actively tried to chemically destroy my brain. The sheer magnitude of Tyler's testimony shattered the courtroom's decorum. The horrific reality of a mother slowly poisoning her husband while her teenage son fought a secret, desperate war to save him hung heavily in the air. Valerie snapped. The calculated facade of the tragic wife violently evaporated. She bolted upright from her chair, her face contorted into a mask of unhinged fury. She pointed a shaking finger at the witness box and began to scream at the top of her lungs. She shrieked that Tyler was a filthy liar. She wildly accused me of maliciously brainwashing our son, screaming that I had poisoned his mind against her to protect my precious corporate empire. She hysterically demanded that the judge strike his testimony from the official record. Judge Caldwell slammed her heavy wooden gavel, repeatedly demanding order in her court, but Valerie simply could not be contained. Amidst the deafening chaos, Tyler remained absolutely still. He did not flinch. He did not look away. He stared down at his screaming mother with eyes as cold and unforgiving as solid ice. He slowly reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small black digital recording device. He held it up for the entire courtroom to see his voice cutting through her hysterical screaming with terrifying absolute precision. "I knew you would say that, Mom." Tyler's voice was steady, betraying no fear, only the resolute calm of a young man who had spent 3 years preparing for this exact confrontation. He held the voice recorder high in the air, its black casing catching the fluorescent lights. Valerie stopped screaming instantly. Her mouth remained open, but no sound emerged as she stared at the device. The noise that had filled the room evaporated, replaced by a suffocating tension. Tyler turned away from his mother and looked up at the bench. He politely addressed Judge Caldwell, his tone respectful but firm. He asked the judge for permission to submit the audio files as direct evidence. He stated that the recordings would permanently clarify his mother's true intentions and prove she committed perjury. Valerie's attorney lunged across his table, waving his hands. He shouted a barrage of panicked objections. He argued the audio was unverified, lacked foundational discovery, and was highly prejudicial. He claimed playing recordings violated every rule of evidence. Judge Caldwell did not look at him. Her eyes were locked onto Valerie, her expression a mask of penetrating suspicion. She had just been handed a pristine medical evaluation, exposing a fraudulent doctor, and her patience was entirely exhausted. She struck her wooden gavel once the sharp crack silencing the lawyer instantly. She firmly overruled the objection, stating that given the severe allegations of medical tampering, she would allow the submission. She instructed the bailiff to take the device from Tyler and connect it directly to the courtroom's audiovisual system. The bailiff walked to the witness box, retrieved the recorder from Tyler, and moved toward the clerk's desk. The entire courtroom watched in absolute silence as an audio cable was plugged into the base of the device. A soft hum emitted from the overhead speakers, signaling the system was live. Tyler instructed the bailiff to play the file. The bailiff pressed the button. For a brief second, there was only the faint static of a room recording. Then a voice echoed through the high ceilings of the courtroom. It was incredibly clear, unmistakably distinct, and completely damning. It was Valerie's voice, entirely stripped of the tragic tone she had just used on the stand. Instead, she sounded impatient, irritated, and ruthlessly cold. "Increase his dosage," the recorded voice of my wife commanded, the sound bouncing off the walls. "The old fool is still asking questions about the accounts. I need him completely pliant before the board meeting." The sheer malice in the recording hit the courtroom like a physical shockwave. The gallery erupted in a collective gasp. Valerie's attorney sank into his chair, dropping his pen onto the table, visibly sickened as he realized his client had just confessed to intentional poisoning on tape. Valerie sat completely frozen at the plaintiff's table. All the color drained from her face, leaving her looking like a hollow porcelain doll. Her hands gripped the edge of the wood so tightly her knuckles turned a translucent white. She could not speak. She could not formulate a lie to defend against the sound of her own voice casually ordering the chemical destruction of her husband's brain. I sat at the defense table, keeping my posture rigid, watching the magnificent reality of her actions being exposed. Before anyone in the room could recover from the sheer horror of the first recording, Tyler quietly leaned into the microphone at the witness stand and instructed the bailiff to play the second file. The bailiff, his eyes wide with shock, quickly tapped the console. The brief static hissed again, and then a new voice boomed through the courtroom speakers. It was a deep, arrogant, confident tone that I had listened to during countless executive meetings. It was the unmistakable voice of Derek Lawson, my chief financial officer. I routed the last $1.2 million through the Delaware LLC. Derek's recorded voice stated, dripping with absolute smugness. Once the divorce is finalized and you have his 60%, we liquidate, crash his stock, and migrate the clients to our new server. The raw confession was absolutely devastating. It was not merely an admission of a standard marital betrayal. It was a perfectly articulated summary of a massive, highly coordinated corporate embezzlement scheme. In less than 20 seconds of audio, Derek had confessed to wire fraud, the creation of illegal shell companies, severe corporate espionage, and a deliberate plot to entirely bankrupt my software firm. He had effectively admitted that the entire divorce and conservatorship petition was nothing more than a legal smokescreen designed to facilitate the hostile takeover and subsequent liquidation of a multi-million-dollar enterprise. The recording proved beyond any doubt that they were using the judicial system itself as an instrument of massive corporate theft. The scope of their greed was breathtaking, exposing calculated criminality that transcended the boundaries of a family court dispute. As the audio file abruptly ended, the soft click of the playback stopping sounded as loud as a gunshot in the cavernous room. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and deeply stunned. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Judge Caldwell sat at the high bench, her face completely transformed into a portrait of pure, unyielding stone. The initial suspicion in her eyes had hardened into a furious, blazing glare. She stared down at Valerie with a look of profound disgust, realizing that the weeping, tragic woman standing before her was actually a ruthless architect of psychological torture and massive financial fraud. The entire facade of the exhausted caregiver had been utterly incinerated. I slowly turned my head away from the judge and shifted my gaze toward the public gallery seated just behind the wooden partition. Derek Lawson was no longer smirking. The arrogant, untouchable confidence he possessed just 10 minutes ago had completely vanished. His face was deathly pale, covered in a sheen of cold, terrified sweat. He looked like a man who had suddenly realized he was standing on the tracks with a massive train hurtling directly toward him. He knew his career, his freedom, and his entire life were effectively over. Moving with slow, incredibly anxious caution, Derek tried to slip away. He quietly pushed himself up from the long wooden bench, keeping his head down desperately, attempting to sneak toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom before the judge could process the audio. He thought he could simply walk out of the building and disappear into the rain. He was entirely wrong. Jonathan had been anticipating this exact moment. Before Derek could take more than 3 steps toward his frantic escape, my attorney rose smoothly from the defense table. Jonathan did not look at Valerie, and he did not look at the judge. He turned his body, raised his arm, and pointed his silver pen directly across the room at the fleeing chief financial officer. His voice rang out with terrifying authority, slicing through the stunned silence of the courtroom. Bailiff, strongly suggest you do not let that man leave this room, Jonathan commanded, his tone echoing off the marble floors. I have just submitted a 400-page forensic audit to the Federal Bureau of Investigation regarding massive systemic wire fraud. The sheer weight of Jonathan's declaration hung in the suffocating air of the courtroom, sealing the exits with an impenetrable barrier of legal destruction. I turned my attention from Derek back to my wife. Valerie sat completely frozen at the plaintiff's table. The terrifying reality of her situation was finally crashing down upon her with the overwhelming force of a tidal wave. The perfectly manicured mask of the tragic, exhausted, and heartbroken caregiver shattered completely into a million jagged pieces, revealing the raw, unadulterated panic of a cornered predator. She looked wildly and desperately at her high-priced corporate attorney, seeking some miraculous legal loophole, some desperate objection that could somehow unring the bell of her own recorded confession. But her lawyer had physically distanced himself, pushing his leather chair several inches away from her, staring at the polished mahogany table with the shell-shocked expression of a man who realized his own career was now in severe jeopardy. Valerie's chest began to heave, her breath hitching in short, erratic gasps as her eyes darted frantically around the room. She looked at Judge Caldwell, whose face was set in a mask of furious, unyielding stone. She looked at me sitting perfectly upright and entirely lucid, stripped of the medicated haze she had so desperately tried to keep me trapped within. Finally, she looked at our son. Tyler stood tall and resolute in the witness box, his dark eyes staring right through her, completely devoid of the fear and submission she had relied upon for years. In that precise fraction of a second, the total irreversible magnitude of her failure registered in her mind. Her entire life, the stolen wealth, the luxurious estate, the absolute control she craved, was completely over. All remaining reason and logic completely abandoned her. Driven by a primal, overwhelming instinct to flee the inescapable consequences of her horrific actions, Valerie simply snapped. She violently shoved her heavy wooden chair backward, the legs screeching harshly against the pristine marble floor. Her attorney reached out, grabbing her forearm and delivering frantic, hushed whispers, desperately urging her to sit down and remain silent. Valerie ignored him entirely. She viciously yanked her arm free from his grasp, tearing the delicate fabric of her elegant navy blue dress in the process. She turned her back on the judge, the witness box, and the overwhelming evidence of her crimes, and she began to physically run toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom. The sound of her expensive heels clattering frantically against the polished stone floor echoed like rapid gunfire in the otherwise stunned, silent room. It was a pathetic, deeply illogical attempt at escape. There was absolutely nowhere for her to go. She could not outrun a federal indictment. She could not outrun a state medical board evaluation, and she certainly could not outrun the recorded sound of her own voice ordering the slow chemical execution of her husband. Yet she ran with the desperate, flailing energy of a terrified animal, her perfectly styled hair falling wildly around her face, her breath coming in ragged, hysterical sobs. She was roughly halfway down the center aisle, her eyes fixed blindly on the exit, when the swift, uncompromising arm of the law finally intercepted her path. The imposing uniformed court bailiff moved with practiced absolute efficiency. He stepped directly into the center aisle, firmly blocking her frantic escape route. As Valerie tried to violently push past him, he reached out and grabbed her firmly by the upper arm, his grip locking around her like a steel vise. The sudden physical restraint shattered the last remaining fragment of her sanity. She began to completely unravel right there in the middle of the courtroom. She thrashed wildly against the bailiff, her arms flailing, her perfectly manicured nails clawing desperately at the air. She threw her head back and began to scream with a piercing, guttural ferocity that chilled my blood. She shrieked that the audio tapes were entirely illegal, that her son had no right to record her in her own private home, and that the entire proceeding was a massive fabricated setup. She completely abandoned any pretense of innocence, screaming that she absolutely deserved every single penny of my corporate equity. She wailed that I had prioritized my software empire over her, that I was a neglectful husband, and that she was merely taking the financial compensation she was rightfully owed for enduring our marriage. Her hysterical, self-serving justifications bounced off the high ceilings, a grotesque symphony of pure, unadulterated greed and absolute narcissism. Judge Caldwell leaned forward over the high bench, her face burning with profound judicial fury. She grabbed her heavy wooden gavel and slammed it down against the sounding block with a deafening, authoritative crack. She repeatedly struck the gavel, her voice booming over Valerie's frantic shrieking, instantly holding my wife in direct immediate contempt of court. She ordered the bailiff to restrain the plaintiff and force her into the nearest chair. The bailiff swiftly maneuvered Valerie back toward the gallery seating, pressing her down onto the hard wooden bench as she continued to openly weep and thrash against his hold. The sheer absolute chaos of her breakdown stood in stark, magnificent contrast to the profound, calculating silence I maintained at the defense table. As the bailiff struggled to completely subdue my hysterical wife, the heavy oak doors at the very back of the courtroom forcefully swung open. The sudden movement instantly drew the attention of every single person in the room. Two tall, broad-shouldered men, wearing dark, conservative suits and grim, entirely uncompromising expressions, stepped purposefully over the threshold. Jonathan had not been bluffing when he mentioned the federal forensic audit, and he had certainly not left the timing of this intervention to mere chance. He had precisely coordinated this exact moment with his contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The two agents bypassed the chaotic scene unfolding with Valerie in the center aisle and walked with absolute mechanical precision directly toward the public gallery. Derek Lawson, who had been frozen in a state of terrified paralysis ever since Jonathan pointed him out, tried to press his back flat against the wooden bench, looking desperately for a way to dissolve into the shadows. The lead agent stopped directly in front of my chief financial officer. He reached into his suit jacket, produced a gleaming silver badge, and stated his name and federal affiliation in a crisp, authoritative tone. Without waiting for Derek to respond, the second agent firmly grasped Derek by the shoulder, hauling him forcefully to his feet. The metallic heavy click of steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around Derek's wrists echoed sharply above Valerie's fading sobs. Derek did not resist. He did not utter a single word of protest. The arrogant, untouchable corporate thief simply slumped his shoulders, his head dropping forward in a posture of complete, absolute defeat. They turned him around and marched him swiftly out of the courtroom, permanently removing the man who had actively plotted to steal my life's work. The judge looks down from his bench. "Mrs. Harrison, this is no longer a divorce hearing. It is now a federal crime scene." The sharp bang of the judge striking her wooden gavel served as the final nail in the coffin of Valerie and her crafted conspiracy. The courtroom, which only an hour ago had been the stage for her magnificent weeping performance, instantly transformed into a sterile holding area. Two heavily armed court bailiffs flanked her, their hands resting firmly on their duty belts. Valerie was completely stripped of her aristocratic elegance. Her navy blue dress was torn at the seam from her pathetic attempt to flee, and her face was stained with smeared mascara. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic terror, as the bailiffs secured her arms behind her back and clamped cold steel handcuffs over her wrists. The metallic click resonated through the heavy silence of the room. She did not scream this time. The absolute crushing weight of federal wire fraud charges had finally broken through her delusion of invincibility. She realized with horrifying clarity that her entire life was completely over. Jonathan leaned against our defense table, watching her being marched out of the doors with professional satisfaction. He quietly informed me that the divorce proceedings were immediately and indefinitely suspended. The family court no longer had primary jurisdiction. Valerie was now actively facing a massive federal criminal investigation, and her fraudulent petition for 60% of my corporate equity had been incinerated by the severe gravity of her own felony offenses. When the sun rose this following morning, it illuminated a radically different reality. I drove to the sleek glass and steel headquarters of my software company, not as the frail, medicated, and confused old man Valerie had desperately tried to fabricate, but as the absolute, undisputed master of my corporate domain. I walked through the sliding front doors with my shoulders pulled back, my head held high, and a cold, calculating fire burning in my chest. I was immediately flanked by my director of corporate security and a team of 4 imposing guards. We bypassed the executive elevators and marched directly into the sprawling financial wing that Derek Lawson had controlled with absolute, unquestioned authority for the past 3 years. The entire floor fell into a terrified silence as I crossed the threshold. The loyalist accountants and junior analysts who had actively facilitated his fraudulent wire transfers looked up from their glowing monitors, the color completely draining from their faces. I did not raise my voice, and I did not display an ounce of anger. I spoke with a quiet, lethal precision. I ordered the security team to immediately lock down every single computer terminal on the floor. I stood in the center of the room and announced the immediate, unconditional termination of Derek's entire department. I watched as security guards handed them cardboard boxes and escorted them out of the building, permanently purging the infection from my company. Simultaneously, Jonathan and his aggressive team of corporate litigators launched a massive, overwhelming legal strike. They filed immediate civil lawsuits against the 3 Delaware limited liability companies Derek and Valerie had clandestinely established to funnel and hide my stolen wealth. Armed with the comprehensive forensic audit from Chicago and the recorded confessions played in open court, Jonathan effortlessly secured emergency judicial injunctions. Within a matter of hours, we had successfully frozen every single bank account, seized every offshore asset, and completely locked down all the capital they had desperately tried to steal. They could not move a single penny or hire expensive defense attorneys to protect themselves from the incoming storm. We had effectively severed their financial oxygen supply, leaving them completely paralyzed and entirely at the mercy of the federal justice system. The swift and brutal retaliation did not end with my treacherous wife and my deceitful chief financial officer. The spotlight of federal scrutiny turned directly onto Dr. Aris Thorne, the arrogant neurologist who willingly sold his medical ethics for a $50,000 corporate wire transfer. The absolute devastation of his career was swift, entirely merciless, and highly publicized. The moment Jonathan delivered the independent state-certified neurological evaluation to the medical board, proving my flawless cognitive health. Dr. Thorne was completely exposed as a paid fraudulent actor. The state medical board held an emergency disciplinary hearing and permanently stripped him of his license to practice medicine. But the professional disgrace was only the beginning of his nightmare. Federal prosecutors, armed with the undeniable paper trail linking his private concierge clinic directly to Derek Lawson and the stolen corporate funds, slapped Thorne with severe, multi-count indictments for criminal conspiracy to commit wire fraud and gross medical malpractice. The highly exclusive, discreet clinic that catered to the corrupt elite collapsed overnight. Federal agents raided his offices, seizing his patient files and hard drives. The man who had confidently taken the witness stand, prepared to condemn a perfectly healthy man to a locked psychiatric facility, was now facing over a decade in federal prison. He lost his pristine reputation, his massive wealth and freedom utterly ruined by his own profound greed. By late Friday evening, the chaotic adrenaline-fueled storm of the past 48 hours had finally begun to settle into a quiet, lingering calm. I was sitting in the familiar leather chair of my home study, looking out the large bay window at the dark silhouettes of the pine trees bordering the estate. Tyler was sitting across from me, a profound, undeniable sense of relief washing over his young features. The immense, crushing burden he had carried in absolute secrecy for 3 long years had finally been lifted from his shoulders. We were quietly discussing his plans for college, talking about a bright, unburdened future, when the sharp, sudden ringing of the telephone shattered the peaceful silence. I looked at the caller identification screen on my desk. It displayed a generic automated notification indicating an incoming call from the county correctional facility. I slowly reached out, lifting the heavy receiver to my ear, and pressed the button to accept the charges. The automated electronic voice stated that I had a collect call from an inmate. Then the line clicked over, and a voice filtered through the static. It was Valerie. However, it was not the commanding, arrogant voice of the woman who had demanded my absolute obedience. It was not the smooth, manipulative tone of the tragic wife performing for a sympathetic judge. It was a small, broken, and thoroughly defeated sound. She was actively weeping, her breath catching in desperate, ragged gasps as the harsh, terrifying reality of a cold, concrete jail cell settled around her. "Richard," she begged, her voice trembling with sheer, unadulterated panic. "Please, you have to help me. They have frozen everything. I have absolutely nothing left. I am begging you, please drop the civil lawsuits against the accounts. I need the money to afford a criminal defense lawyer. If you do not unfreeze the assets, I will be forced to take a public defender, and they are going to put me away for decades. Please, Richard, I will sign whatever plea deal you want. I will give you anything you ask for. Just please do not leave me in here to rot." I did not answer her desperate plea over the telephone. Instead, I simply broke the connection, letting the heavy dial tone serve as my initial response. However, I knew that a phone call was not the proper way to end a 20-year marriage that had culminated in such profound betrayal. I needed to look her in the eye one final time. I needed to see the absolute reality of her defeat. The next morning, I drove my car through the heavy Seattle fog toward the county correctional facility. The building was a massive brutalist structure of gray concrete and coiled razor wire, entirely devoid of the warmth and luxury Valerie had spent her life relentlessly pursuing. After clearing the rigorous security checkpoints, I was escorted down a long, sterile corridor, smelling faintly of industrial bleach and stale despair. I was directed into a small, highly secured visitor booth, divided by a thick pane of bulletproof glass. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a dull, monotonous rhythm, casting a harsh, unforgiving glare over the small metal stool where I waited. The atmosphere was incredibly heavy, thick with the collected misery of countless broken lives, and yet for the first time in 3 years, my own mind felt perfectly clear and absolutely free of shadows. A few moments later, a heavy steel door on the opposite side of the glass swung open with a loud mechanical clank. A stern female correctional officer escorted Valerie into the small enclosure. The transformation was absolutely staggering. The elegant, highly sophisticated woman who had completely commanded high society galas and effortlessly intimidated corporate executives was entirely gone. She was wearing a shapeless, faded orange jumpsuit that swallowed her frame and highlighted the severe slump of her shoulders. Her face completely devoid of the expensive cosmetics and luxurious treatments she relied upon. Like armor, looked incredibly hollow, pale, and deeply aged. The confident spark in her eyes had been completely extinguished, replaced by the wide, frantic stare of a trapped animal. Her hair, usually styled to absolute perfection, was pulled back into a messy, unkempt knot. Her posture was completely stripped of its usual arrogant rigidity, leaving her looking small, fragile, and utterly pathetic. She sat down slowly on the metal stool, picking up the black telephone receiver with violently trembling hands. I picked up my own receiver, staring directly through the thick, smudged glass at the woman who had secretly plotted to chemically erase my mind. Her eyes were intensely bloodshot and severely swollen, reflecting a level of pure, unadulterated terror that she had never once experienced in her highly pampered, sheltered existence. "Richard," she whispered, her voice cracking as fresh, hot tears immediately spilled down her hollow cheeks. "Thank God you came. Please, you have to listen to me." I was terrified. Derek completely manipulated me. He constantly told me the company was failing, that you were making terrible decisions, and that we were going to lose absolutely everything we had built. I was only trying to protect our family, to protect our financial future. She pressed her free hand flat against the cold glass, looking at me with a desperate, deeply calculated expression of profound sorrow. "We were married for 20 years, Richard. 20 beautiful years of a life shared together. We built an incredible home. We raised our precious son together. You simply cannot throw all of that away because of a terrible, misguided mistake. Think of Tyler. Think of what a massive, highly publicized criminal trial will do to him. The media spectacle will completely destroy his future." She wept openly now, letting the heavy tears fall freely, desperately trying to use the very son she had emotionally terrorized as a final pathetic bargaining chip to secure her own freedom. Her sheer audacity to invoke his name after everything she had subjected him to was truly staggering. I looked at her without a single shred of pity. The intense anger that had sustained me for months, the burning rage that had fueled my silent performance in our home had completely burned away, leaving behind a cold, absolute, and highly focused void. "Valerie, you did not just try to steal my money," I stated, my voice echoing with a low, lethal precision through the plastic receiver. "You tried to completely steal my mind, my dignity, and my entire life. You systematically fed me poison while looking me directly in the eyes with a warm smile. You used my son's home as a staging ground for murder. You forced a brilliant teenager to fight a secret, terrifying war in the shadows just to keep his father alive." She opened her mouth to argue, her face twisting in denial, but I raised my hand instantly, silencing her pathetic objections. "You will get absolutely no deals from me. There will be no backroom negotiations, no generous financial settlements, and absolutely no mercy whatsoever. Jonathan is working directly and aggressively with the federal prosecutors, and we are pursuing the maximum possible legal penalties for massive wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and attempted poisoning. You will face every single devastating consequence of your horrific actions, and you will do it entirely alone." The sheer absolute gravity of my words struck her with immediate physical force. Her mouth dropped open in a silent, agonizing scream as the final, inescapable realization crashed over her. She brutally slammed her fists against the thick, unyielding glass, begging, pleading, and hysterically promising me absolutely anything I desired if I would simply drop the civil lawsuits and unfreeze her stolen assets. She wailed that she would sign over everything, that she would leave the state, that she would never bother us again if only I would save her from the cold reality of a federal prison cell. I did not say another word to her. I maintained my cold, steady gaze for one final agonizing second, letting her see the complete absence of the man she thought she had broken. Then I slowly and deliberately placed the heavy black receiver back onto the metal cradle, instantly cutting off the sound of her frantic, pathetic hysteria. The absolute silence on my side of the glass was incredibly empowering. I stood up smoothly from the metal stool, turned my back on the secure visitation booth, and walked away down the long, echoing concrete corridor. I did not look over my shoulder, but I could clearly feel her weeping violently against the cold glass, sliding down to the floor in total, absolute ruin. My footsteps were remarkably steady, carrying me out of that dark, miserable facility and back out into the cool, refreshing air of the Seattle morning. I drove my car back to the sprawling estate in complete and absolute silence. Pulling carefully through the tall iron gates, I parked the vehicle and walked slowly through the heavy wooden front doors. I stood in the echoing foyer of the massive empty mansion. The air felt entirely different now, entirely cleansed of the toxic, manipulative tension that had poisoned it for so long. The dark war was finally over, but the sprawling battlefield was incredibly quiet. I took a long, steady breath. It was time to rebuild. The process of rebuilding the company was remarkably swift once the parasitic infection had been completely surgically removed. Derek Lawson had spent years quietly siphoning our resources, bleeding our quarterly profits dry through his labyrinth of illegal offshore accounts and fabricated shell companies. With him permanently locked inside a federal holding cell, the financial hemorrhage stopped instantly. I appointed a brilliant, thoroughly vetted team of independent forensic accountants to completely restructure our internal oversight protocols. We aggressively pursued the frozen assets, successfully repatriating every single stolen dollar back into the corporate treasury. Without Derek maintaining his constant calculated drain on our capital, the company did not just stabilize it, experienced an unprecedented explosive surge in pure revenue. Our stock valuation climbed to record heights within a matter of weeks, proving that the underlying foundation of my entire work was always rock solid. But I was no longer willing to leave my legacy exposed to the treacherous vulnerabilities of standard corporate governance. I retained the most ruthless estate lawyers in the country to establish a completely impenetrable ironclad financial trust. I locked every single corporate share, every real estate deed, and every liquid asset behind a fortress of complex legal barriers. The trust was specifically engineered with layers of biometric security and independent board approvals guaranteeing that neither Valerie nor Derek nor any of their corrupt associates could ever touch a single cent of my wealth. My empire was finally permanently secure from any future external threats or internal sabotage. The sheer relief of knowing my decades of exhausting labor were thoroughly shielded allowed me to finally breathe. It was a profound victory, measured not merely in recovered millions, but in absolute, unquestionable sovereignty over my corporate destiny, ensuring my wealth remained perfectly safe and protected forever from greedy corporate vultures. With the corporate battlefield finally swept clean and my financial legacy safely locked away, I desperately needed to step out of the sterile, high-pressure environments of boardrooms and courtrooms. I needed to reconnect with the one person who mattered most in this entire world. Early one Saturday morning, before the bright sun had even fully crested the horizon, Tyler and I drove out to a quiet, isolated lake nestled deep within the lush, evergreen forests of the Cascade Mountains. The air was incredibly crisp and clean, carrying the incredibly fresh scent of pine needles and damp earth. A thick, silvery mist rolled gently across the glassy surface of the dark, serene water. It was a stark, beautifully profound contrast to the suffocating tension and artificial fluorescent lighting we had endured for the past 3 highly traumatic years. We sat together in a small wooden boat, the gentle rhythmic rocking motion matching the peaceful cadence of our casting lines. For a very long time, we simply sat in deeply comfortable silence, listening to the soft rhythmic plop of the fishing lures breaking the surface of the water and the distant haunting call of a lone loon echoing through the towering trees. I slowly turned to look directly at my wonderful son. He was staring out across the peaceful water, the harsh defensive tension finally melting completely away from his broad shoulders. I took a deep breath, letting the cool, refreshing air completely fill my aging lungs, and I looked him directly in the eyes. I softly told him that spoken words would never be enough to truly express my absolute boundless gratitude. I genuinely thanked him for his unyielding courage, for bravely fighting a terrifying war in the shadows, and for literally saving my entire life when I was defenseless. Tyler lowered his fishing rod, his dark eyes meeting mine with a quiet, profound maturity that no teenager should ever be forced to develop. I clearly saw the lingering ghosts of his anxiety, the invisible scars left behind by the psychological torment his mother had caused. I reached across the small boat and placed my right hand firmly on his shoulder, desperately needing him to understand that the dark chapter of his young life was permanently closed. I told him that he no longer had to carry the crushing, suffocating weight of the world on his back. He did not have to be my secret protector, my hidden investigator, or the silent guardian of our family. I proudly informed him that I had already fully paid his upcoming college tuition to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, officially securing his place in their elite, highly competitive cybersecurity program. His brilliant, intensely analytical mind had successfully saved my massive corporate empire from absolute, catastrophic ruin, and now it was time for him to hone those exceptional technical skills in the bright light of a prestigious university, surrounded by enthusiastic peers rather than vicious, manipulative predators. I absolutely assured him that the enormous software company and the entire impenetrable financial trust would be waiting for him whenever he was truly ready to take the reins. He was the sole, undisputed heir to my entire legacy, but I made it perfectly clear that his only job right now was to simply be a normal young man. He deeply needed to study to learn to make careless mistakes, to laugh loudly, and to finally experience the beautiful, unburdened freedom of youth that his mother had so cruelly stolen away from his grasp. He finally smiled back at me, a beautifully genuine expression of profound relief. The grinding wheels of federal justice move exceedingly slow, but they turn with an absolute terrifying finality. Many months after our quiet morning on the tranquil lake, Jonathan called me with the final, irreversible results of the criminal proceedings. Valerie, completely stripped of her manipulative charm and facing a massive mountain of undeniable audio evidence, had finally exhausted all her pathetic legal maneuvers. The federal judge, entirely unmoved by her hysterical courtroom theatrics, sentenced my former wife to a mandatory 15 years in a high-security federal penitentiary without the remote possibility of early parole. Derek Lawson, whose massive corporate embezzlement scheme had actively catalyzed the entire nightmare, received a devastating 12-year federal sentence, permanently ending his lucrative career and effectively ruining his arrogant life. The corrupt neurologist Dr. Aris Thorne was currently awaiting his own lengthy criminal trial from behind the thick safety glass of a cold county jail cell. The judicial system had ultimately worked. The malicious criminals were severely punished, the stolen corporate wealth was completely recovered, and the innocent victims were firmly protected. But as I sat peacefully on the stone porch of my heavily secured estate, looking out over the beautiful, quiet grounds, I knew the absolute, undeniable truth. The system did not actually save us by some miraculous, incredibly fortunate accident. The system worked perfectly solely because we had meticulously engineered our own flawless survival. We had firmly refused to be helpless victims, we had brilliantly weaponized their blind arrogance against them, and we had aggressively fought back with a cold, relentless, calculated precision. The dark, terrifying war was officially over, and we had completely, undeniably won the ultimate hard-fought victory, securing our peaceful future against all incredibly malicious threats, and ensuring that my beloved family legacy would endure forever perfectly untarnished. The process of rebuilding did not happen overnight. It required the exact same relentless dedication and unwavering focus that I had used to construct my software empire from the ground up decades ago. 2 full years passed since the heavy doors of the federal courthouse had slammed shut on Valerie and Derek, sealing their fates. In that time, I completely restructured my company from the inside out, implementing rigorous layers of security and financial oversight to guarantee such a massive internal fraud could never happen again. When my 71st birthday finally arrived, I knew with absolute certainty that the primary phase of my reconstruction was fully complete. It was a crisp, brilliantly clear Tuesday morning when I stood before a crowded room of financial journalists, corporate stakeholders, and industry analysts at our headquarters in downtown Seattle. The bright flash of camera lenses illuminated the wooden podium as I took the microphone in my hand. I looked out over the sea of waiting reporters and calmly announced that I was officially stepping down from my position as Chief Executive Officer. I was not retreating into the obscure shadows or surrendering my life's work to the slow, inevitable march of time. Instead, I was deliberately elevating myself to the highly respected role of Chairman of the Board. I retained absolute oversight, holding the ultimate veto power over the strategic direction of my company, but I permanently relinquished the grueling, deeply exhausting daily operational grind. To fill my former position, I introduced a highly vetted, fiercely intelligent outsider named Marcus Sterling. I had spent 6 exhaustive months personally interviewing him, running deeper background checks than the federal government, and rigorously evaluating his core ethical framework. Marcus possessed the exact combination of ruthless corporate efficiency and unshakable moral integrity that my company so desperately needed to safely navigate the incoming decades. Handing him the operational reins felt incredibly liberating. It was the deliberate, conscious choice of a mature man who finally understood that his legacy was secure enough to stand tall without his constant physical presence. That momentous transition granted me something I had not genuinely experienced since my late 20s. It gave me true, unadulterated clarity. Valerie and her corrupted neurologist had spent agonizing months trying to forcefully convince the entire world and slowly convince me that my advancing age was an insurmountable weakness, a terrible terminal disease that rendered me entirely useless. But simply stepping away from the microscopic details of corporate management allowed me to fully realize that my age was actually my greatest, most impenetrable armor. My mind had never been sharper. The toxic chemical fog of the daily lorazepam doses was entirely purged from my biological system, leaving behind a profound crystalline sharpness that absolutely nothing could dull. I quickly found a renewed, exhilarating sense of purpose in the quiet spaces of my new life. Instead of constantly battling aggressive board members over quarterly profit margins, I began spending my afternoons advising young, remarkably hungry technology startups. I openly offered my decades of hard-won corporate experience to brilliant, eager kids working out of small residential garages. I found immense joy in actively mentoring them, not just on exactly how to build a highly profitable algorithm, but on how to safely navigate the treacherous, predatory waters of extreme wealth without losing their inherent moral compass. I specifically taught them how to properly identify the highly subtle warning signs of deep corporate deceit, and exactly how to completely insulate themselves against the kind of catastrophic betrayal that had nearly claimed my entire life. It was incredibly fulfilling, deeply meaningful work. I was actively molding the next ambitious generation of young innovators, finding a deep, abiding peace in freely giving away my accumulated knowledge rather than fiercely guarding it behind closed corporate doors. This profound, undeniable sense of internal peace eventually extended directly to the physical walls of my personal life. During the long, quiet afternoons, I often found myself slowly walking through the sprawling corridors of the Seattle mansion. For the first few difficult months following Valerie's highly publicized arrest, the massive house had unfortunately felt like a terrifying, echoing mausoleum perpetually haunted by the dark, lingering memory of her horrific deceit. Every incredibly expensive ceramic vase, every single piece of rare imported furniture, had reeked intensely of her incredibly superficial ambition and her calculated venomous malice. So I completely and utterly tore it all apart. I hired a massive team of aggressive contractors to entirely gut the master suite, the main kitchen, and the formal dining room. We stripped away the cold, modern aesthetic she had desperately craved, completely replacing the sterile white marble with warm, inviting mahogany and deeply comfortable spaces. I deliberately converted her incredibly luxurious dressing room into a heavily secured state-of-the-art server room, specifically for Tyler, happily giving my brilliant son a dedicated quiet space to further develop his exceptional coding skills. The dark, oppressive energy that had hung over the estate like a suffocating shroud was entirely banished. As I walked slowly past the grand central staircase today, I stopped to look out the massive bay windows toward the calm waters of the Puget Sound. I realized with a sudden wave of genuine emotion that the mansion no longer felt like the hostile, dangerous staging ground where I was almost quietly murdered in my sleep. It finally felt like a real home. It felt like a solid, impenetrable fortress of absolute peace. The freshly painted walls no longer held any dark, terrible secrets. The shadows no longer contained any looming threats. The silence was no longer a terrifying sign of unseen conspiracies, but a genuine, remarkably comforting stillness. I had fought a long, brutal war to reclaim my rightful territory, and I had miraculously emerged completely victorious. The late afternoon sun began to dip below the distant horizon, casting a warm, golden glow across the manicured lawns. I turned away from the window and walked slowly down the long hallway toward my private study. I entered the room, the heavy door closing behind me with a solid click. The study was exactly as I had originally designed it decades ago, lined with classic literature, aged leather, and the soft light of a single desk lamp. I walked over to the imposing mahogany desk and lowered myself into the executive chair. I folded my hands together, resting them on the pristine surface, and looked directly forward. The terrifying journey of the past 3 years played continuously through my mind like a vivid film. The horrific personal betrayal, the agonizing deception, the chemical warfare waged against my own brain, and the merciless destruction of those who arrogantly sought to bury me. I had survived the darkest, most treacherous valley a human being could ever be forced to walk through. I had faced the absolute worst of human greed and emerged with my sharp mind, my wealth, and my precious son entirely intact. I took a very deep, steadying breath, allowing the absolute tranquility of the quiet room to wash over my shoulders. I looked directly toward the camera, completely ready to share the ultimate truth I learned from surviving the ultimate betrayal. They thought age equated to weakness. They looked at my 71 years of life and saw nothing but an easy mark, a fragile, fading old man, ready to be chemically erased and completely financially drained. Valerie and Derek had stared at my wealth and my quiet demeanor and genuinely believed that a few crushed sedatives in a warm cup of evening tea would effortlessly usher me into a quiet, forgotten oblivion. They calculated their odds based on the arrogant assumption that my decades of success had somehow made me soft-blind and hopelessly dependent. But they forgot one incredibly crucial detail about my past. You do not survive 40 years in the ruthless, cutthroat corporate world simply by being lucky or compliant. To build a massive software empire from absolutely nothing, to construct a global enterprise from a single rusted desk in a damp basement, you have to learn exactly how to fight in the absolute darkest of shadows. You have to systematically outmaneuver and completely crush wolves much hungrier, much smarter, and far more lethal than a greedy, superficial wife and a slick, profoundly arrogant chief financial officer. I had spent my entire adult life dismantling hostile takeovers and entirely destroying corporate predators who would have eagerly eaten Derek Lawson alive for a mid-morning snack. Valerie made the ultimate fatal mistake of entirely misjudging my character. She deeply mistook my quiet domestic peace for foolish passivity. She genuinely believed that simply because I had willingly taken off my heavy armor when I walked through the front doors of my own home, I had somehow completely forgotten how to wage a ruthless war. She was catastrophically mistaken. I had never lost my sharp edge. I had simply chosen to keep it carefully sheathed. When they actively threatened my life, my dignity, and the hard-won legacy I had bled to build, I unsheathed that weapon with a cold, terrifying precision. I moved with a silent, calculating exactness that they never even saw coming until the cold steel of justice was already resting firmly at their throats. And perhaps far more importantly, they made a massive, unforgivable miscalculation regarding the collateral damage of their treacherous plot. They entirely forgot that my son, the quiet, highly observant teenager they so casually dismissed and continuously tried to psychologically subjugate, carries the exact same wolf's blood in his very veins. Tyler did not cower in the corner. He did not break or fold under Valerie's tyrannical, deeply abusive warfare. He possessed the profound, unyielding courage to stand completely alone in the dangerous shadows, meticulously gathering concrete evidence, carefully watching the predators prowling within our own home, and patiently waiting for the precise, optimal moment to strike. He proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that true, enduring strength is ultimately forged in the scorching fires of adversity. Together, my son and I did not just barely survive their treacherous, cowardly ambush. We completely and utterly annihilated them. We took back our home, we secured our massive company, and we reclaimed our unburdened future permanently, leaving the pathetic conspirators to rot in the cold, unforgiving reality of a federal penitentiary. As I sit here today looking around the peaceful silence of my study, I feel a profound, undeniable sense of absolute completion. The dark, suffocating storm has finally passed. The sky above is brilliantly clear, and the bedrock foundation of my family legacy is entirely unbreakable. I walked through the absolute darkest depths of deception, and I have confidently emerged with a renewed, unshakable power. The empire I built is secure, but the bond I share with my son is the true triumph. We faced the ultimate betrayal and emerged completely victorious, forever bound by the silent war we fought and definitively won. I am no longer just a survivor. I am the absolute master of my fate, and nothing can break us. Never mistake the quiet stillness of an older man for weakness, and never underestimate the loyalty of a child who sees the truth. Betrayal often comes wearing a smile and carrying a cup of tea, hiding in the most intimate corners of our lives. The greatest defense against manipulation is unwavering vigilance and the courage to act in silence. Trust is a beautiful thing, but blind trust is a death sentence. Always protect your legacy, verify the intentions of those around you, and remember that true strength lies not in avoiding the storm, but in calmly becoming the storm yourself. If this story resonated with you or taught you to keep your eyes open, hit that like button and subscribe. Now, drop a comment below telling me where you are watching from and how you handle toxic people in your life. Stay sharp, stay strong, and see you next time.